I spent my career researching, interviewing, and trying to get people to see these offenders for what they are. They are the most cunning, manipulating offenders you will ever meet. They're like sharks in the water, and they will completely take your legs away from under you. I remember the first day I ever walked in the CID office, they were all smoking. There wasn't a computer in the room, it was the manual typewriters. Nobody had a mobile phone, nobody even had a pager. It was pretty, old school way of doing stuff. Started working on murders and major crime, armed robbery, and serious assault. And then I sort of moved to the major crime teams where I started to run them, so as a detective chief inspector and then as a superintendent. I went on all the courses, kidnap, extortion, serious crime courses and SIO courses. So I was quite highly qualified. So I was dealing with the top spec of the work at that time, which was what I wanted to do. We dealt with a lot of high profile serial sex offences like serial rape. And one of the things that I became sort of interested in is why people behave the way they do. What are the motivational factors? What draws someone to behave in that way? We can all understand why someone robs a bank. We know that they need the money, it's about greed. We can understand why someone murders their partner because they run off with their best friend. It's a crime of passion. We see it all the time. We see it on every television show ever shown. But the motivation behind sexual crime is very interesting. I now know it's much more complex and there's more going on for the offenders. About 7 or 8 years before I was due to retire, the Home Office came to me and said, we're looking for somebody to create a behavioural analysis unit at the Child Exploitation Online Protection Centre in London. That is now part of the National Crime Agency, so Britain's version of the FBI, for want of a better expression. And there I ran the behavioural analysis unit. Went to America, did some cross-training with the FBI, BAU3, which is crimes against children, and then came back to the UK and created a mini version of what the FBI do in London. And so that was the first time the UK had ever had a unit dedicated to sexual crimes against children. In my world, as a profiler, I don't go to crime scenes and say, okay, there's a footprint there, there's blood on the wall, broken window, the guy you're looking for is 6'4", walks with a limp and drives a white van. That's unknown offender profiling, it's Hollywood and it really doesn't work and it's pretty guesswork really. What I do is known as offender profiling, which is typology. So I've studied one particular type of criminality, these particular group of offenders, and I know that group of offenders well enough to be able to look at a crime or consult on a crime and say, okay, the person you're looking for might be like this.
Do you remember some of those early cases you worked on?
Yeah, I mean, I was involved in an investigation with a man called Brian Field, who was a serial child abductor and sexual abuser, and he actually murdered a boy. And that was a historic crime from the 60s, and we identified him on DNA, and I went to Birmingham and arrested him and interviewed him. There was a sort of understanding between us that he would talk to me about his behaviour and his past. And that sort of interested me because I was always interested in how does someone get from being a young, innocent child, how do they get to a place where they behave in such a way where they abduct, sexually abuse and murder children. So that was an early case that I was involved in. Millie Dowler was another one. She was abducted in Walton. I worked on that investigation. So yeah, those sort of investigations, those high profile, serious crimes, those high profile homicides are, they're interesting to work on, but they bring a lot of pressure as well. One of the things about child abduction and child murder is that nobody's really interested in them until there's a crime. The minute there's a high profile crime, the minute there's a Madeleine McCann or a Millie Dowler or one of these April Jones, all these high profile child abduction, child murders, the minute one of those cases happens, everyone's suddenly interested in this particular type of crime. And then over the years, it's either detected or not detected, and then it fades back into the memory and people are not really interested again until the next crime. But when they do happen, These are mega homicides. They attract the attention of the media and the press all over the world. Thankfully, they are rare, but people are really not interested in it until it becomes an issue, and then they only ask the questions that they think they need to know the answers to, whereas I'm interested in much deeper questioning.
You mentioned Madeleine McCann. It's true that you were the first British detective on the ground out there?
I was one of the most senior British detectives that was sent out there, yeah. And I was head of behaviour analysis at CEOP in 2007, in May 2007, when she went missing. And my job was, because I had some understanding of child abduction and child murder, my job was to go and give the Portuguese police some advice about how they might think about running the investigation. Not necessarily how to run the investigation, but some of the people that might be suspects and whether or not they would be viable suspects in the early days of the investigation.
With such kind of intense media hype and scrutiny on that case, how was that investigation for you at the time?
Well, for me, it was pretty frustrating. I think I spent 10 days there. I think I arrived in Portugal 2 days after she went missing, saw Jerry and Kate McCann, spoke to the people running the investigation. But very quickly, I became very frustrated by the way the Portuguese police conducted the investigation, the limited information they were giving us. And then it became apparent very quickly that our advice wasn't particularly welcomed by the Portuguese police. So it became very frustrating. So after 10 days, I returned back to the UK, wrote a lengthy report, and let the Portuguese get on with it. And then in 2011, they needed a review of the investigation that CEOP led, and I wrote a large portion of that review that led to the Metropolitan Police reinvestigating it, and I think that investigation is carrying on still today.
Do you think they're any closer to understanding what happened to her?
I think the guy, Christian B., who was locked up in Germany, seems to be a very good suspect. He seems to have all of the things you would look for in someone that would abduct and murder a child like Madeleine McCann. He would be an unusual offender if he lived in London. He would be an unusual offender if he lived in New York, and yet he's living less than a half a mile away from where she went missing, on a small Portuguese town. So if you're asking me, do I want to prioritise him as a suspect, the answer would be yes. I spend a lot of time in prisons interviewing people about terrible things that they've done. And then I try and use what they tell me in research. I add it to the research that's out there. And then I try and train investigators and child protection specialists to get inside the head of the offender, to walk in their shoes.
So hypothetically, you're about to go in and sit down with someone who you suspect has committed sexual offence against children. What's your technique? What's the first thing you say?
Before you say anything, you've got to do your research. You need to know the crime really well, and you need to know and understand what the offender did. Now, what is also interesting is that there's very different motivations for why people behave the way they do. So understanding that there are different kinds of child abuser, understanding that some of those that sexually abused children are what's known as exclusive, which means they only are interested sexually in children. Some are non-exclusive, which means they have adult relationships, they're married, they've got their own children, and they still sexually abuse children. So that's one category. The one below that is psychopaths. Everyone talks about psychopathy, but very few people know a psychopath. Psychopaths are very charming. They plan ahead, and they do not have any remorse or empathy. They can't walk in other people's shoes. And it's mainly about the way psychopaths' brains are wired. Whereas sociopaths are normally the result of trauma, neglect. They're volatile, they behave erratically. They're much more of a loose cannon than the psychopath. The psychopath will always be more dangerous because they're calculated and planning. So in my world, understanding the two is quite important. And of all the men that I've interviewed, mainly men, some women that I've interviewed as well, but mainly the men, very few of them have been psychopaths. And then the one below that is what's known as undifferentiating offenders, which means they will sexually abuse adults, they'll sexually abuse children, they range right across the spectrum, and they just simply don't have any moral code at all. So they are sexually indiscriminate. And then the final one is sadists. They're sadistic offenders who are all about humiliation, degrading, they're all about pain, physical and psychological. So understanding the different typologies, understanding the different types, and also understanding that child sexual abuse against children is not just about sex. It's far more complex than that. Something sexual happens with the child and between the child and the offender. But what we know is that these offenders are trying to fulfill other human intrinsic needs. And understanding what those needs are is the secret to building a rapport with the suspect.
And what do those needs typically look like?
Well, sometimes they can be very complex, but in general terms, there is a concept which is quite well known, which is called self-determination theory, which talks about as human beings, we need autonomy, relatedness, competence, which is power and control. And what we know with offenders that sexually abuse children is they're human beings just like you and me. They go to the same schools, pubs, clubs. They learn to see children in a different way. So everyone often asks, are people born with a sexual interest in children? The answer is no, because there is over 60, nearly 70 years of research, a body of research, a huge body of research, mainly from the UK, America, Australia and Canada, that says that this is a learnt behaviour. I've interviewed John Duffy, who is one of what's known as the railway murders, railway rapists. They abducted and murdered children and women in the 80s from trains all over London. John Duffy and a man, his accomplice called McCann, they stalked women in the early 80s. They picked them up from railway stations, took them to an isolated place, raped and murdered them. And they called themselves the Thriller Killers. They used to drive along listening to Michael Jackson's Thriller in the car, stalking women. And so when I interviewed John Duffy and I said to him, tell us a little bit about your crimes, he said to me, oh, well, you know, I found the thrill of the chase much more exciting than the actual crime itself. So as I started to interview him and started to unpick his life, I took him all the way back to his childhood and I said, tell me about your school days. And he said, oh, yeah, that was good. And when we started to unpick it, it turns out that he was expelled several times for chasing one particular little girl in the playground and sexually assaulting her. And so to me, there seemed to be the origins of this intrigue about stalking and hunting. He then moved on to hunting birds and animals. And so for me, there seemed to be some sort of connection between his behaviour in childhood and his later adult sexual offending. And when I pointed it out to him, he said, you know, I've never really thought about that, but now you mention it, you might be right. So that just goes to show you that if you give people enough time and you ask them the right questions, sometimes you can give them something that helps them understand their own behaviour.
Is there any truth that the abused become the abuser?
The vampire theory. Sometimes in my world, that's called the abuse excuse. And what we know is that this urban myth that people that sexually abuse children were sexually abused themselves, we know it's just not true. Yeah, you're no more or less likely to become a child abuser, a sexual child abuser, if you were sexually abused yourself. And think about it logically. If that was true, the majority of children that are sexually abused are girls, not boys. So if that was true, the majority of our adult sex offenders would be women. So that doesn't fly. So it's an urban myth, and it's often an urban myth which offenders like to try and suggest to people. So when offenders get caught, often they're deeply ashamed, the majority of them are deeply ashamed, embarrassed about what they've done, and they try and rationalise, minimise, justify, sometimes even intellectualise what they've done. And often they will say, the reason I did this is because I was sexually abused. And they do that to try and get people to see them in a different light, to turn them from a predator into a victim. because sex offenders are all about manipulation. They're all about impression management. They are the best manipulators, the best groomers you will ever meet.
Is it often opportunistic? Is it to do with the fact that there's a child that they know in their family? How much of it is kind of chance on that day, and how much of it is pre-planned?
Well, it depends what type of offender they are. So we still know from research that the majority of child sexual abuse happens interfamilially, happens in the family, which is terrible. Some offenders can be opportunistic. Some offenders will react to the moment. In criminology, that's known as situational theory. So let me give you an example. In my study group of men that abducted, sexually abused and murdered children, most of those men were married, had their own children. Some of them, when they've abducted and murdered a child, were on their way home from work. We're going to the shop for a paper. We're going to get a pint of milk from the local supermarket. And at that moment in time, they were confronted with a situation. They saw a child, they thought about it, and they acted on the spur of the moment. So in effect, they were in the right place at the right time, and the child was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's why investigating child abduction that leads to child murder is so difficult, because it's very random. Where the offender bumps into a child or has first contact with a child is almost impossible to predict. So that's what makes it a difficult crime to investigate.
And what would be the motivation for someone to murder a child?
In nearly all the cases where I've interviewed men that have abducted and murdered children, they said it was to avoid detection. So it was never about it being some dark, deep fantasy to murder a child. It was always about, if I let this child out of the car, if I let this child go, they can identify me, they can lead the police or the authorities back to me. It was always about self-preservation and not getting caught.
Do you believe them?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this idea that there are lots of sadistic murderers that get off on murdering children, in my experience, is a fallacy. Most of the offenders that I've spoken to that have done terrible things to children, they don't look like a sex offender. They don't behave like a sex offender. Paradoxically, sex offenders live amongst us. They hide in plain sight, but they thrive on secrecy. So they are very good at blending in. They are very good. Most sex offenders you'll ever meet hold down good jobs. They're integrated into their society. Often they will have their own children, their own relationships, and you wouldn't look twice at them in terms of sexual abuse of children. The only ones that you sometimes would look at and say, I'm not too sure about that, is these, what we know as exclusive, people that are exclusively interested in children and nothing else. And often with those type of offenders, what you find is they spend an awful lot of time with children. They are very in touch with children and the way they think and the things they do. And if you get an offender like that, then that should be a red flag.
Would they be the type of offenders to maybe have a job at a school?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, under interfamilial offending, the next highest category is positions of trust. So teachers, swimming coaches, gymnastic coaches, we've seen the stories in the national papers all the time.
With someone like Ian Huntley, he famously went on the news. What motivated him to go on the news and kind of speak out when he knew what he'd done?
Ian Huntley was convicted of the murder in Soham of Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, 10-year-old girls. And I think one of the issues around him was that he was very high profile. The press spoke to him. He spoke about being the last person to see the girls, which is an enormous red flag straight away for any investigator. But I think what you're seeing there is that there was a level of autonomy. He thought he could manage the situation. There's a phrase with a lot of offenders called duping delight, where they enjoy being able to manipulate people around them. So I think what you see there is someone who felt confident enough to be able to stand in front of the national TV cameras and try and front it out that he was a witness rather than the offender. So that's a level of arrogance and power and control and autonomy that is off the scale.
Parents, how can they protect their children if it is, someone who is their swimming coach or their after school teacher?
Well, I mean, it's like anything. In this world, knowledge is power. You know, if you understand a little bit about the way sex offenders work, you understand some of the red flags, you understand that if you're going to put your child into a swim coach or a new trampolining coach or sports coach, then your job, I believe, is to go and ask some difficult questions. Go and speak to the person, gauge, form your own opinion, ask where they worked before, ask the club what vetting has been done. But ultimately, you know, child protection starts at home. It starts with a relationship between you and your child. You should have a relationship with you and your child where, and I know it's easy for me to say, where you can be as open and as honest, and you say to your child, if it feels odd, if there's something you're not happy with, let's talk about it. Tell someone. Because 9 times out of 10, what children don't know, they suspect something's going on, they know something's not right, they just feel uncomfortable around this person, but they don't know what to say or how to say it. So for me, child protection is really about the relationship you have with your child, and hopefully it's an honest and open relationship where you can talk about things.
Can sex offenders or paedophiles be rehabilitated? Can they change their way of thinking?
Well, you're into the realms of treatment programs. Well, the thing about treatment programs, the first thing to say is treatment programs shouldn't be called treatment programs, because the word treatment implies that there's a cure. And what we know is if someone develops a sexual interest in children, it is a lifelong way of seeing children as sexual beings. They never ever stop seeing children that way. When offenders get caught in the UK and they go to prison or they don't go to prison, we put some kind of management around them. We put them on the sex offenders register. They have a registration officer with their local police force. We try and manage them, manage their life and stop them going back to prison, stop them reoffending. In America, where I work a lot, they have a very different approach. They don't do a lot of managing sex offenders at all. So what we do know is that if sex offenders come out of prison and don't have any support, they are more likely to offend. If they come out of prison and there's a support network around them, then some will reoffend, but some, or the majority, will work very hard not to reoffend again. The most commonly asked question I'm asked is, why would someone do that to a child? And I always have to say the same thing. That is the wrong way of approaching it. What you should be saying is, how do they see the world so that they think it's rational and acceptable to behave in that way? Because if you demonise them, if you start from that place that you can't get your head around why they behave like that, then you'll never understand it. If you try and overlay your moral code and the way you see the world on their behaviour, you'll never understand it. I spent my career researching, interviewing and trying to get people to see these offenders for what they are. They are the most cunning, manipulating offenders you will ever meet. They are the brightest offenders you will ever meet, and they are very skilled at what they do. And if you don't bring your A game when you're a police officer or a social worker, they will take your legs. They're like sharks in the water. They sense that you don't know the topic, they sense that you don't understand it, and they will completely take your legs away from under you. And the other question I'm often asked is, how do you do what you do? You know, how do you sleep at night? Well, I sleep pretty well. I mean, I don't think about my work when I get home. I do make a lot of effort to do what's called ring fencing, which means my work is my work and my private life is my private life, and I never let the two meet. And then again, you know, sometimes it just earworms you. Something comes back into your mind, something an offender said, something they did. But, you know, the secret is to separate the two worlds.
What's over your 40-year-long career, what have you learned most about humans?
I've learned that human beings can do the most terrible things to other human beings, but I've also learned that for every bad human being in the world, there's many more good people in the world. You know, get it into perspective. The world that I live in, where I interview men that abduct, sexually abuse and murder children, it's a rare crime, thankfully still a rare crime, and they're a small group of offenders and they're a hard to reach group of offenders, which is why very few people have done research into them. That's why I'm one of the few people that has actually researched that group of offenders. But get it into perspective, yeah? There are more good people than there are bad people in the world, But you need to think about protection, you need to think about street proofing, and you need to make your children worldly wise.
This was someone who was stalking Claire, was fixated and obsessed with her and intrusive in her life and would not take no for an answer. And she was terrified. And at 20 to 8, when Claire's looking at one of her colleagues, she worked on a cosmetic counter and she's looking at the time and saying, "We're almost done." He comes up behind her, shoots her once in the back of the head, 3 times in the face. And then he turns the weapon on himself.